In America, you generally find parenthood less supported. Our social institutions really aren't designed to promote family life. We have an economic system in which most of the power and money goes to the people who work the longest and ignore their families, or try to palm off the child rearing on somebody else, whether it's a spouse or it's a paid caregiver. But as long as we really have a value system that says we're going to give you the most money and power if you ignore your family, then we can't really call ourselves a family-friendly nation.
Hey there, and welcome to the Paula Ferris Show. I am your host, Paula. So how often do people say, they're your kids, they're your problem? Or they tell you, well, if you didn't want these issues, then you shouldn't have had kids in the first place, right? Oh my gosh, that drives me bananas. We have been talking about the state of families here in America and how stressful it is to be a parent here in America the last couple of weeks. Last week, we had the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, on to share with us how Australia's family-friendly policies like childcare subsidies and paid family leave, how that bolstered their economy, how it strengthened families, how they did it in a non-partisan way. It was very bipartisan. And it really kind of leveled the gender equity gap, too. So this week, what we're going to do, we are going to talk about America's record low birth rates. I'm not sure if you know, but we're having fewer and fewer kids to the point where we have our lowest birth rates in over a century. But should we care? Should we care about this, right? And how does it affect us, even those of us without kids? We know that other countries, like France and China even, are really pumping a lot of money into their economy to reverse their low birth rates, because without kids, you don't have a labor force, you can't grow the economy. But here in America, we're not really doing much about it. And look, I'm not trying to make any political statements in this podcast. I respect how you vote. I'm not going to tell you how to vote. I think you have to do what's best for you and your family, full stop. But that said, we need to do a much better job in this country of supporting families through bipartisan policy, not just because it's the right thing to do, not just because it strengthens families and it levels the gender equity gap, but it also bolsters our economy. We need to make it an economic issue. So what I want to do today is invite a friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Glass. She is a sociologist. She is also the executive director for the Council for Contemporary Families. I interviewed her a ton for my book, You Don't Have to Carry It All, Ditch the Mom Guilt and Find a Better Way Forward. Her research was fantastic. I cite her research all the time in my keynotes, in my presentations, and her research has really changed my life. But this is her life's work, and I nerd out with just about everything that she has to say. And I love what she's doing at the end of the day to strengthen families. And that's what it's about, supporting families, not just through attitudes, but also through policies. So what Dr. Glass is going to talk about today is the record low birth rates. Should we care? Why should we care? Why shouldn't we care, right? She's going to explain the policies here in America versus the policies in other countries that really support families. She's going to tell us why she thinks the employer should not pay, and also her ideas on how we can pull this off and make America a very family-friendly country and take some of the stress and strain off of parents in raising kids. And finally, she's going to tell us what gives her hope. So without further ado, Dr. Jennifer Glass, sociologist, the executive director on the Council for Contemporary Families, my dear friend, someone that I admire deeply. And make sure you stick around to the end of the conversation for my key takeaways. Here's Dr. Glass. Dr. Jennifer Glass, I am so grateful to be reunited with you on this podcast, and I cannot thank you enough for sharing your wisdom with me and my readers. For You Don't Have to Carry It All, Ditch the Mom Guilt and Find a Better Way Forward. I can't tell you how many times I cite your work, Dr. Glass. You are an inspiration to me. So just thank you for the work that you're putting into the world. It's great to see you again.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast, and you're very welcome. I'm excited when people actually read my research and can find something useful in it. So that's very gratifying to hear.
Oh, I nerd out with your research, okay? I have loved your research. I cite it in almost all of my talks. You're doing such great work for families, Dr. Glass. And what I want to really talk about today is the record low birth rates. We're seeing record low birth rates here in America. So let's jump right in. Tell me, how is this concerning to you?
Well, unlike some of my peers, I actually do think that a rapidly lowering birth rate is a problem. It's a problem in two senses. One, it's a problem for our economy and how we've set up our retirement systems and pension plans. We need a robust number of working age adults in order to fund a comfortable retirement. And in an aging society, you just have too many people retiring and not enough people working. And a lot of people think, well, if I save enough money, I don't have to worry about that in my old age. But the truth is, your money is only as good as the currency you're using. And if the dollar isn't worth as much because our economy isn't as strong, then you just can't save your way out of this problem. Mm-hmm. Not to mention the fact that as you grow older, you need the support systems that are provided by younger adults. You need a doctor and a nurse. You need someone who does massage therapy. You need the bagger and the checker at the grocery store. You need the person who delivers your groceries. And all of those are younger people. So we are all intergenerationally dependent. And I do think rapidly aging societies historically have had weaker economies. But I also think that it's important because we know that young people in the United States report wanting more children than they actually have. So this is not an issue about trying to motivate people to have more babies. They want to have children here in the U.S., but we've made it very difficult for them to do so, particularly financially. And as a result, we see pretty rapidly falling fertility. Now, why is it happening now? The quick answer to that is restricted immigration. When people say, oh, the birth rate's such a concern, I remind them that for native-born American women, the birth rate hasn't actually fallen very much. It's been low for 20 years. We just haven't seen it. We've masked it by large numbers of immigrants who come from high fertility regimes. And by that, I mean countries where childbearing still makes you better off financially rather than worse off. So agricultural or agrarian economies where children's work is still an important part of how you make ends meet. And it takes those folks a generation or two before they realize, oh, I'm not in that kind of society anymore. And having lots of children is going to make me poorer, not richer. And it's not going to help me in old age because their taxes are going to go to support everybody, not just me. Mm. And so what we've done is we've kind of stripped bare our dependency on immigration, which most people don't like talking about very much right now.
They don't. They really don't. And we are keeping it apolitical too. But that's interesting that we haven't seen it because it's been masked for so very long. So you just said it's an economic issue, which I completely agree with. And you're seeing countries like China and Singapore and Taiwan and East Asia, who have had low birth rates almost mandated for decades. And now they're pumping millions and billions into their economy because they're realizing, oh, crap.
Big mistake.
We can't grow our economy if we don't have a labor force.
Right.
People don't get that, Dr. Glass. They don't get that it's an economic issue. And it really is.
It is. China's the fastest aging population in the world right now, and it's an enormous country. But India isn't far behind. India achieved below replacement fertility a few years ago, and it's wildly uneven. But you can really see the more affluent areas of India have a birth shortage, and the poor areas that are still agricultural have much more robust birth rates. But even there, it's like the news has leaked out. You will be better off in this economy if you have fewer children. So even immigration isn't going to last because other countries are also lowering their birth rates. So you're going to run out of young people who are willing to leave their home country and go elsewhere.
Right. So you talked about how this is concerning. Why do you think this is happening? Why are we seeing these record low birth rates? You just mentioned something that's very important to point out. It's not that we are desiring to have fewer kids. Right. We just are because of the stress and the strain, particularly here in America. But why do you think we are having fewer and fewer and fewer kids?
I'm going to crib from a quote from MacArthur genius Nancy Folbray, who said this about 20 years ago. But I think it sums everything up in a nutshell. She said, we've privatized all the costs of raising children, and we've socialized all the benefits. And I thought that was a great way of capturing it because it points out that raising children is an individual investment. We've basically said parents are responsible for all of the costs. But then when you look at what happens when they grow up and they become productive, tax-paying citizens, you see that all the benefits are going to other people. It's going to government in the form of law-abiding citizens who pay their taxes. It goes to employers who get well-educated workers that they didn't have to birth and raise. They just show up on your doorstep. And whatever wages you're paying them, you're still making a profit off of their labor. And in the kind of old-fashioned farm agrarian cultures of 150, 200 years ago, that profit would have gone to the parents who raised those children, not to an employer or a stockholder. So it's hard to see the way we've socialized the benefits. Social Security is a great example. Everybody pays into the system. Some people also raise future workers, but you get paid out of the system whatever you paid in. And the cost that you incurred raising the next generation of workers doesn't get you any particular advantage in the Social Security system. So the kind of theoretical emphasis I want to make is that when you take away the benefits, the fiscal benefits of having children, and you kind of socialize them to the whole population, you have to think about, well, then who's paying the cost? Should it just be parents paying the cost? And I would say that this birth strike that we're seeing right now is happening because women are paying too many of the costs. And if you look at that, the costs are both the costs in money and also the costs in time. So mothers are the ones that are spending the most in terms of money and time raising children. And one of the things that my new research has shown is that over 70% of American moms are going to end up the primary earner, the breadwinner for their kid, their first child before that child turns 18. And so this is becoming not a universal phenomenon, but basically a majority phenomenon. Way more mothers than not are going to face a period of time when they are financially responsible for keeping their household afloat. And a lot of times that happens because it's a single mom, but the fastest rate of growth is among partnered moms. So these are moms who are partnered to fathers who lose a job or face a health crisis or get laid off temporarily or see a temporary reduction in their work hours or in an industry that's collapsing and they have to learn a new skill. And this is really not just a phenomenon of working class dads. It's also increasingly a phenomenon of middle class dads. And we see this throughout the economy. I know that there are other pundits out there who are writing about, the jobless crisis among American men and things of that nature. But you really see it when you look at who's responsible for financing childhood, who's responsible for paying for kids' daily needs, and then who's providing kids' daily care. And the answer is increasingly women for both questions. And I think that's really behind the declining fertility rate.
And you hear about the mom default, where out of the gate, it becomes the mother's responsibility to, quote unquote, raise the kids, which that's not how it was like in American history. But it's our responsibility to not only work, but we are now managing all the responsibilities at home. We're raising the children. We are the default for everything. And you can see where the inequities then rise. But we should all be concerned about these record low birth rates, should we not?
Yes, I think so. Only because it's a reflection of a population unable to achieve the family size that they want. And what's happening is that you see young women who will just tell you outright, I would have another child, but we just can't afford it. I can't afford to take the time out of the labor force. I might lose my job. My health insurance increasingly comes from mom's work, not dad's. So we wouldn't have any health care. So there are all kinds of reasons why mothers decide, I'm going to stop at one, or couples that decide the time has never been right. We just don't have enough money socked away. And when you think about it, even a hospital birth costs several $1,000s now with insurance. If you don't have insurance, it's in the tens of thousands. And this is why so many women, I think it's about 50% of births, are now paid by the Medicaid program because parents have so little money that they literally can't even pay the cost of birth. So it's right out of the gate. You see this huge expense.
Right. And as somebody, you and I were both huge advocates. I mean, you have a doctorate. You are the executive director of the Council for Contemporary Families. You're doing so much work. I literally just got into this work a couple of years ago when I formed Carry Media, but I am a mom of 3 and I understand the marginalization of mothers, the marginalization of women, but especially how we're treated differently once we become moms. We talk about the stress and the strain of having kids here in America. And it blows my mind, Dr. Glass, that we can say we are a family-friendly country when we do so very little to support families. And you're seeing it now with these record low birth rates. I mean, how can we say that we're family-friendly when, as you said, the onus is pretty much privatized? It's on us. It's your kid, your problem, right?
Yes, yes. That really is the attitude. It's not, these are our kids and this is our future economy. It's like, oh, this is your problem. And if you didn't want to pay, you shouldn't have had children in the first place. And that is the attitude, I think, that drives me nuts because it fails to see how interconnected we all are. If only the people who could afford to have children had children, we would look far worse than China and South Korea. We would have one of the lowest birth rates on record. Because right now, I just looked at the recent USDA estimates for a middle-class standard of living, what it costs to raise a child from birth to age 17. This is not including college, folks. And it was almost $300,000
per
child. Yeah, per child. So if you think about, well, you want people to have about 2 kids on average. Some will have none. Some will have more. We're not saying everybody should have exactly 2, but you need about a little more than 2 in order to replace your current population. And if you just look at 2 kids, that's over $500,000 that a family with 2 children at a middle class standard of living is paying that a family without children doesn't have to pay. So if you look at that enormous expenditure and then you add college to it, it almost looks like a foolhardy decision. And it's probably a good thing that not a lot of young people are listening to me talk right now because they will hear these numbers and get really scared.
But that's what we're hoping to change that for the next generation. And we know that this next generation, especially millennial dads, are so much more involved than their dads were. And Gen Z, the number one benefit that they want over healthcare is childcare. So I do have a lot of hope in this next generation that they want a family, but I want them to have the freedom to have that larger family and to feel that support if they indeed want to. Before we dive into this happy gap and some of the research that you did, which was mind-blowing, and I can't wait to share it with the audience, let's talk a little bit about the policies here in America. How can we say we're family-friendly when we offer very little? We don't offer subsidized childcare. We don't offer paid leave. We don't offer universal pre-K. Can you tell us a little bit about the policies here in America? And then we'll talk about some of the family-friendly policies in other countries. So let's start here at home in America. What do our policies look like?
Well, our policies are really bad at the federal level. We have very little federal legislation that even until recently guaranteed that a pregnant woman wouldn't be fired. We used to have the Pregnancy Fairness Act, which basically just said you can treat pregnant women the same way you treat other disabled people. And if that's bad, no problem. So if you don't do anything special for just people with disabilities, you don't have to do anything special for pregnant women either. That wasn't much in the way of job protection. Now, we've just passed a law that says you have to do better than that. You have to treat pregnancy as if it was a temporary disability and provide the similar types of accommodations that you would with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that was a big win for pregnant women. But other than that, we really don't ask employers to do very much at all in terms of either accommodating women who are pregnant or accommodating new mothers. We have an unpaid 12-week leave, which most women can't access, or if they can access, they can't afford it because they can't afford 12 weeks without pay. So what we see are a lot of what I call de facto parental leaves that are longer than that, with women quitting their jobs and then trying to stretch out their savings as long as they can, and then trying to return into the labor force as quickly as they can in a different job. And the problem with that is that you lose all your seniority. You lose all kinds of benefits that might have accrued at your previous employer. So it's really important to keep mothers in the same job, if it was a decent job, over that childbearing period. And you can't really throw money at the problem. I think child tax credits are a great idea. I think they've helped a lot of families, and I hope we have larger child tax credits in the future. But it's really hard for any government entity to give a family as much money as a mother can earn with a part-time or a full-time job. I mean, there's just way more money that she could make if she was employed. So we want to make sure that mothers who are employed can stay employed, because so many families need that income or will find themselves dependent on that income in the future as the sole source of financing for the family. So that's number one. But I'm not in favor of saying, oh, yeah, let's keep all moms in the labor force slaving away at 50, 60 hours a week and never being around their kids. That's not a solution either.
You should not have to choose between kids and career. And also, once you become a mother, you're more efficient, productive, courageous, you're a better leader. All of those things, measure the measurables. You need our voice and vision in the workplace, but you also need to value us as mothers first. Okay, off my high horse. Go ahead.
No, you said it perfectly. One of the things
we're super passionate about this. So.
No, you did a great job. I think that we have too much evaluation that's based on FaceTime at the office. And we have all of these entrepreneurs now saying, oh, I want everybody back at the office because I think something magical happens when everyone's at the office. And I always chuckle a little bit because there's really very little scientific evidence to suggest that that is true. That might be what managers want or what entrepreneurs want. But if you actually look at how creative people work in my field, I spend most of my time in teams that are all around the country and sometimes around the world. So even if I showed up at my office 40 hours a week, I would still be on Zoom. I would still be texting. I would still be emailing and attaching documents. I would still be doing all of those things. And I think almost everybody else is in the same kind of environment, especially when we're talking about these kind of large entrepreneurial companies that want everybody back to the office. And so I think that we need to go to metrics that don't depend on FaceTime. And we need to acknowledge the successes of remote work during COVID because they're so helpful at actually increasing time spent on task. The number of people who talk about, hey, I didn't have to get up in the morning and spend half an hour fixing my hair and my face, and I didn't have to travel in traffic for 45 minutes. That got me so irritated and stressed that by the time I got to work, all I wanted to do was drink coffee and hide in my office. So we tend to forget and discount the ways in which greater flexibility at work improves productivity and especially improves the work-family balance of families, which is really very integrally interconnected with our fertility crisis.
Right. It's all about strengthening the family at the end of the day. And if you have these family-friendly policies, it will strengthen families. And when the family wins, everybody wins. Some of the other policies that aren't in place, you said we do have a child tax credit, but what is it, $500 a kid? I mean,
it's not very much. And we also have a standard deduction per child. I read a recent estimate. Actually, it wasn't so recent. It's probably dated by now. That said, if we had kept the standard deduction per child at the same level in terms of proportion of median income that it was during the Eisenhower administration, it would be over $7,000 per child. And I haven't looked lately because my dependents are grown, so I don't see it on my taxes. But I think it's hovering at about $2,500 to $3,000. I mean, it's really nowhere near what an inflation-adjusted deduction would be per child. So we haven't given families the ability to keep enough of their own income to raise their children. We do a better job for low-income families, but then we have this kind of benefit cliff where all of the tax breaks that you get just sort of slowly die out. So for working class couples and middle income couples, it's still a big tax pinch. But I think that people would be more willing to pay their taxes if they felt they were getting more of what I call social insurance in return. And that's the big difference between us and Europe, is that we think of government spending as entitlements and taxes as bad. And in Europe, they think of taxes as insurance premiums, like a Social Security premium. If you pay the Social Security tax, you will get something at the other end down the line. And so they feel the same way about things like parental leave. If I buy this insurance, if I ever need a parental leave, or for that matter, my own personal health care, right? It's a family and a paid leave policy. So if your own health is bad, you also can take advantage of that leave. So it's an insurance policy that everybody can use. And they think the same way about other kinds of government benefits, like healthcare, that it's actually part of an insurance policy. And these insurance policies are needed because when you go through the life course, if you have children, there are times when you really need the benefits from those things. So they see childcare in much the same way, that you have childcare like an insurance. It's a social insurance. In case you have kids, you're not going to get slammed with $10,000 to $20,000 a year in the first 5 years of life. Instead, you're going to be taxed, but you're going to have this kind of comprehensive schooling system where from the age of 3 on, there is a trained and licensed person who's not just watching your kid, but is actually teaching your kid.
Okay, so this is so good. Childcare. We have we don't have subsidized childcare. If we subsidize childcare even a little bit, I read that we would increase our GDP by 1.6 trillion. We lose 122 billion in our economy every year because of the lack of access to quality and affordable childcare.
Right.
And it's the number one barrier to women in the workforce. So childcare, let's dig into this. In other countries, you just hit the nail on the head. It's not just affordable childcare, it's quality childcare, and it's seen as early childhood education, right?
Yes.
It's an investment, and it can start very early, and it can be guaranteed in some countries, right? And you may only pay 25%, but it's highly subsidized. It's viewed as early childhood education, and it's an investment into the kids and the future of their country, because they realize these kids are the future of our country. They're not your kid, your problem, which is a stark difference to the attitude here in America. Like, you figure it out. Your kid, your problem. And I can't, like, nothing pisses me off more. Sorry, I don't mean to be like vulgar, but it just, that attitude, I don't have time for it. I just don't.
I completely agree.
It upsets me.
It's as if we fail to acknowledge the fact that, hey, you either care about this child early in life when you can intervene if the kid is having any problems, or you intervene later in life when the child is turned into a criminal, or the child is turned into a drug addict, or the child simply doesn't have the self-discipline or has learning disabilities that were never diagnosed and can't work. So it is your problem, whether it's your kid or not. And we all have an investment in making sure that families are strong. And I think that if you actually sit down and talk to people, most of them recognize that. There's just an awful lot of arguing about who should pay. And I think that one of the things that we want to get away from is the idea that employers should pay, because I don't think employers should pay for leaves. I don't think employers should set up their own childcare centers. I think that's asking too much of employers. If we all benefit, then we should all chip in. So yes, employers have a role to pay in that chipping in. But I think the organization of things like leaves can't be left to the discretion of employers, because A, small businesses can't afford it. It's not fair to saddle them with the same costs that large employers can pay. But B, it also kind of shifts the lens as if this is just a problem of work and employment, but it really isn't. It's a problem of the citizens of the future, and everybody has a stake in that, not just employers, but it's pretty much everyone, all taxpayers, everyone who lives in our society.
So the Lanham Act was in force in World War II because all the men were at war. The women needed to be in the workplace because they needed laborers. They got that up and running in a couple of weeks because they said it was essential to the economy. Okay, we can get it up and running. But I will say, okay, so we did have a universally paid, subsidized childcare program here in America, right? A lot of people don't trust the government, and I'm not sure I do trust it. I don't know if I trust big government, Dr. Glass, to handle this and to handle it correctly and to not misappropriate my money, because that's what it seems like they do. You just said you don't think it's the responsibility of businesses or small businesses or corporate America. Do you think this is the state's responsibility? Like, what would a solution in your mind be? Is it a federally funded program, or maybe the federal government is giving funds to each state to then determine their own programs, which I think is probably the best solution. I just don't trust the federal government at this point with much of my money. I would love to say that I do, but I just don't. What do you think is the best solution here?
Well, obviously, we want to make this as inexpensive as possible, and we also want to provide high quality care. And we also face declining fertility. Well, it just so happens that we have this institution in every single neighborhood in America called a public school. And those public schools have room now to expand to pre-K because they have fewer children in K through 6. And so one of the things that makes a lot of sense is to think about locally controlled public schools as an arena through which you can build out a child care system at the pre-K level. The other thing you have is a lot of state bureaucracy that already exists for certifying teachers. And we have a system for weeding out, sometimes it works great, sometimes not so great, but for weeding out people that don't do a good job. And so maintaining standards and maintaining some parental control over what's going on via, school boards and local elected officials is a lot easier to do if you have your local school districts involved in the provision of care. Now, are all local school districts trustworthy? Probably not. And there's a role for federal assistance in virtually any school system, because Oftentimes there are concentrations of kids who are low income or concentrations of kids with disabilities, and those taxpayers are not going to be able to provide enough. So I think that if we look exclusively at school funding, we can see already that relying on local property taxes has been a disaster in a lot of places, especially poor communities and poor states. And so there's a role of the federal government, not in taking over, but in supporting and using tax
coming
revenue.
alongside.
Right.
Coming alongside.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think that if you're going to do that, then there's also a role for the federal government in setting standards that says, hey, Mississippi, you have to do as good a job as Massachusetts. You know, we're not going to say it's okay to have accredited teachers here, but not here. So I do think that you do give up a little bit of control. But I think that whenever you've got an institution, you're going to give up a little bit of control based on who's financing the institution. The important thing about local governance is that at least there's a role for parental input. And if things displease parents, if people in the community are unhappy, whether they're parents or not, at least they have a voice in what's happening. So is it perfect? Probably not. But it's a place to start that's going to be, I think, less chaotic and more efficient than saying, oh, you're going to have to come up with a separate school facility and you're going to have to pay for heating and cooling and all of the rest that would go along with starting a new childcare system from scratch.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I mean, this is everything that you do. This is your life's work, right? And what you do for a living. And I love that perspective about taking advantage of a facility that's already there. It's a public school. It's not going to be a perfect system, but it's a place to start. But we can't escape the reality that we don't have subsidized childcare. We barely give child credits. We don't pay for universal pre-K. Mm-hmm. We don't have paid family leave. How can we say, we just can't say it. We just can't say that we're family friendly, right?
No.
We can't say it.
No, not at all. We don't create built environments. I've been saying this for a long time. It's so funny to me that we have this Council of Economic Advisors that's supposed to advise the president and Congress about everything that has to do with the economy. But we don't have a Council of Family Advisors that says, hey, what's the impact of this policy going to be on families' lived experiences? How's this going to affect fertility? We never ask those questions. And so we end up kind of privileging the views of certain people who look at certain indicators of how well the economy is doing and assume that anything that's good using those particular metrics is going to somehow trickle down and be wonderful for American families. What we have, as Jessica Calarco says in her new book, what we have is a system where mom just picks up the slack. Whatever isn't working out under current policies of employers or government or individual community standards, moms will just pick up the slack. But moms are fed up and moms are tired and moms are overworked and moms are starting to say, no.
Yep.
You know.
And we can't carry it all. Yes, we have tried and we are bitter and burdened and burnt out. And that's not good for our families. That's not good for our partners. That's not good for our kids. And it's just inequitable. It just because we can and we have does not mean that it's right. It needs to be equitable. Parenting, family, it needs to be a team sport.
In America, you generally find parenthood less supported. Our social institutions really aren't designed to promote family life. We have an economic system in which most of the power and money goes to the people who work the longest and ignore their families or try to palm off the child rearing on somebody else, whether it's a spouse or it's a paid caregiver. But as long as we really have a value system that says we're going to give you the most money and power if you ignore your family, then we can't really call ourselves a family-friendly nation. And there are just nation states that have done a better job of recognizing that and saying, you know what? It's unfair to reward people who don't do their part in caring for the world. And all they look for is money and power. We don't want to just reward that behavior. We want a level playing field where people who care about their families and take care of their families can also compete for money and power.
But I do think it's so beautiful what other countries are doing when it comes to the collective group care and their attitude, Dr. Glass. And, you know, my dad is from Lebanon. We went back to Lebanon a couple of years ago to visit family. And they live with each other. There's rebar, which is like tall, skinny beams on the top of the roof, the four corners, waiting for the next family member to move in on top of one another. They do life together. They expect one another to ask for help. And they're offended if you don't ask for help. So it's very interconnected. Kids aren't seen as a nuisance in other countries. They're seen as the country's future. Okay, policy aside, we have an attitude problem about kids.
Right.
Not? We have an attitude problem about the next generation. How do we even solve that?
It's going to be tough. And it's going to be tough because unlike a lot of other nations, we're very diverse. And our children are even more diverse than our adults are. And so you have to have a vision in which every child counts. And as long as you're railing about people that you think are of a different race or a different religion or came from a different background and you other their children, then it becomes really difficult to say, hey, everybody's children count. And so I think that's one of our blind spots is that we think, especially I think more affluent Americans, think that everybody should just have planned all of this out ahead of time. They should take care of their own and not need any assistance from anybody else. So there's kind of this ingrained American individualism that sometimes comes out in what I would call irreligious and racist ways that kind of say, well, I only want certain kids to count, or I only want kids who look like me to count, or I only want kids of certain parents to count. And kids don't have any say in any of this. They didn't ask to be born of a certain race or religion or region of the country or anything else. But they're here. They're here right now, and they deserve our care. They deserve our attention. And if we don't give it to them, we will, in fact, have to deal with the consequences later. And then everybody will be pointing fingers at everybody else for, why something bad is happening. But the truth is, we know how to support families. We know what works based on countries that are similar to our own, like Canada and Australia and Great Britain. We don't have to go to, Denmark or Sweden. We can look at what has worked in other countries. We can look at our own cultural institutions and ask, what is it that makes it so horrible to take Friday afternoon off for your kid's soccer game? Why do we allow these signals of hyper involvement in work to be rewarded all the time? I love the work of industrial engineers who found out a long time ago that most people have peak cognitive capacity for about 6 hours a day. So if you think about somebody who's working 10 or 12 hours a day, they're only at their peak for about 6 hours a day.
Right.
And you can kind of see that if you're honest at workplaces where everybody's expected to stay until 6 or 7 or 8. There's an awful lot of drinking coffee and schmoozing around the water cooler and showing up for boring meetings that really didn't have to be held. And a lot of people will tell you, yeah, if you cut to the chase, they're actively working about 6 hours a day.
Wow. Hey, engineers, they're smart. Let's listen to them. Let's go with a 6-hour work week, which you could say that's been piloted, a 4-day work week, a 30-hour work week. And we've seen gains in productivity, gains in profit, gains in mental health and happiness, all of it. So, okay, we've thrown a lot at people. I don't want it to be heavy. I do want it to feel solution oriented, but sometimes you got to peel the layers back and show everybody what's really happening behind the scenes. Let me just, in closing, I want to ask you so we can land on a positive note somewhat. What gives you hope? And I love what you just said. We don't have to look to Europe. We can look at Canada. We can look at Australia, countries that are very similar to us. What gives you hope that we can one day say we are a family-friendly country in our attitude and in our policy? Where we can turn things around, where we can start to have more children if we want to, where we can start to say, I am my brother's keeper. How do we get there, and what gives you hope that we can get there, Dr. Glass?
Well, you're going to laugh when I say this, but COVID actually gave me hope because we saw a lot of people's opinions about family policy change during the pandemic.
That's
They
right.
realized that you could be productive if you worked from home. They realized that there are an awful lot of jobs out there where if you had a more flexible schedule, it's not the end of the world. And actually, it might actually be better for your business. We have seen change at the individual level. A lot of parents that were doing well, right? Not facing a lot of work-family conflict because they had a lot of resources at their disposal, they kind of had the veil ripped from their eyes, and they saw that not everybody has that. And a lot of families were really heavily burdened. And we saw tremendous support for all of these programs and policies that assisted families and brought so many children out of poverty. So we have this kind of natural experiment in what's possible. And the question is, can we continue to do that? And if we continue to do that, who's going to pay? Because we can't just, keep making our deficit bigger and bigger and bigger as well. So it is going to be painful to spread this burden around those who are currently parenting children, those who used to, but don't anymore, like me, and those who haven't yet and may never do so. So we are going to have to ask more sacrifice from those who aren't currently active parents in order to make things better for those who are active parents. But as a grandparent, I'm more than willing to do that for the parents of my grandchildren and the parents of other people's children. So I think that we need to see more of this in our cultural conversations. And we need to have a little bit more faith and trust that the things that we saw happening during the pandemic can, in fact, become permanent policies.
That's so good. I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing, the research to strengthen and support families. And I love all of the things that you're putting out there, Dr. Glass. How can people, and I know you're a professor of sociology at the University of Texas, and yes, you're the executive director of the Council for Contemporary Families, but how can people stay up to date? What can people do in their own community, and how can they keep in touch with you if they want to really get a better grasp and understanding and appreciation for the research that you're putting out there?
Well, I can always be found at the University of Texas website. So if you type my name in there, Google it, I'll pop up. But I think more than that, pay attention to what the people in your community are saying. Pay attention to what local leaders are saying. Pay attention to what's going on with your mayor, your city council, your state representatives, and ask them these questions. I used to tell my students when they were seniors and about to go on job interviews, I said, I know you don't want to jeopardize by asking nosy questions of the jobs you really want, but everybody interviews for maybe one or two where you're not all that interested. Press them on their workplace policies. Press them on what they do when someone gets pregnant or has a health crisis. Press them on how many hours you're expected to show up at the office. Press them on those kinds of things, whether they have flexible schedules, whether or not taking paid vacation days is going to be seen as disloyal to the company. So the more they hear that bright young minds care about these working conditions, the more likely they are to change them.
Oh, that's so good. And again, we mentioned it earlier, but Gen Z, very, very aware and values childcare benefits above healthcare benefits. Millennial dads spending so much more time with their kids. I do have so much faith in this next generation that the responsibility of parenting will be much more equitable between partners in general. But it is my hope and prayer that we can give them the support that they need from a policy and also an attitudinal level that I am my brother's keeper. That is my prayer for America. It really is. And I'm not going to stop yapping until I can be a part in changing that. So, Dr. Glass, thank you so much. I'm speechless sometimes. I love your work. I love what you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much.
I have no idea where you fall politically. You don't know where I fall politically, but we can agree that when the family wins, everybody wins, right?
Absolutely.
However we get there. So thank you so much. God bless you, Dr. Glass. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
A couple of things before I dive into my key takeaways from this conversation. I would love it if you could rate or review the show. It really helps these podcast platforms determine what they're going to promote. And I really think these conversations need to get out there. Thank you for your feedback and for, sliding into my DMs to tell me the topics that you want to talk about, because that drives this conversation. It drives this podcast. And also make sure you're signed up for my personal newsletter at paulaferrisofficial.com. We're going to keep these conversations going. I'm going to be polling you some important questions. I want to hear from you. And I also want to celebrate you. I have some fun giveaways, and I love to share with you my favorites every other week when I send out the newsletter. Okay, next week on the podcast, before I dive into my takeaways from this conversation with Dr. Glass, John is going to be joining the conversation next week to kind of wrap up his thoughts on what's been happening with the podcast and also the things that he and I have been really struggling with in this season of parenting. And we're also going to catch up with my friend Stephanie, who left the United States for Spain in hopes of a more family-friendly environment. We're going to check in with her and see how she's doing and her big takeaways after being in another country, raising her kids and her family in another country. And then we're also going to be leaning into some really tough conversations with our kids, the sex talk, talking politics with them, negotiating with them. Those are all conversations that are going to be happening in the next month or so. Okay, my key takeaways, and there are several of them, from this conversation with Dr. Glass. First of all, I thought this was really fascinating. Just from a policy standpoint, she says we have a Council of Economic Advisors, but nowhere do we have a Council of Family Advisors. And how will this impact families? We never ask those questions. And she said what we've done is we have privileged the views of certain people. We have a system where mom just picks up the slack. I think that's really fascinating. And it's given me quite a bit of ammunition to just do something about this and really press and advocate and be more of an activist in this area, that we do need family advisors. How will this impact the family? Because how can we have economic advisors and they're not thinking about this? Because family-friendly policies do one thing better than anything else. They bolster the economy. Okay. And we heard that from Prime Minister Scott Morrison time and time again in last week's conversation. So that's one of my key takeaways. The other is something you and I can do is paying attention to what the local leaders are saying. She said, ask them questions, press them on their workplace policies, press them on how many hours, you're supposed to show up at the office. And the more they hear about this, the more they are likely to change. We have a lot of influence at the local level. And I think that's where most of the change will come, not from the federal government, but from our local elected officials, from our local leaders, our state leaders. And, she said that there is a role for federal assistance, but not in taking over, but in coming alongside and supporting. And I liked one of her solutions for early childhood education. She said we can use the public schools. They're already there. They're in place, and build out a childcare system at the pre-K level through our public schools. I thought that was a really great idea. And it's a really good starting point. But look, we have a lot of work to do in this area. It's so important that we keep talking about it, that we change things for the next generation. I do not want my kids to grow up in an America where they have to choose between kids and career, and where they are at DEFCON levels of stress, and where raising kids and the stress and strain is so stressful that maybe they decide not to have kids. No, you shouldn't have to choose between the two, especially when we know that when families are supported, everybody wins and the economy wins. So look, lots of work to do. That's why we are talking about it. I hope you learned a ton from this conversation. And I just have literally all the admiration in the world for Dr. Glass and what she's doing and really trying to support families. And that's what I'm trying to do through these conversations. And by the way, I'm not making political statements, nor am I making college basketball statements. If you're watching on YouTube, I do like Duke basketball, but they are not my team. I'm just wearing my son's t-shirt. Okay, no statements are being made there other than I really like this color blue. All right, we will continue to talk about it. Make sure you slide into my DMs. Tell me things you want to talk about. That's what fuels and drives all of these conversations on the show. Thank you for your support. If you could rate or review it, it would mean the world, and it would help these conversations really get out there. I'll see you next week as we keep talking about it, and make sure you tune in next week because Johnny Goodtimes, my husband, is back. I know you guys thought you were done with me, but not quite yet. I have one more thing to tell you about. If you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, don't forget to subscribe to the show. I don't want you to miss a single beat or a single conversation. And remember, my DMs are always open. Tell me what you want to talk about.